In 1998, I developed an approach to communication that I have spent the past 26 years working on revising and building it up to the theory that it is today. I call it yield theory, and in this video, I'm going to put it in a nutshell and summarize it for you. Let's start with this. Every time we communicate, we do so because we want to be heard. Otherwise, why say anything at all? We communicate both verbally and non-verbally. At the end of the day, when we speak, we want to be heard. But the reality is that we're not always heard. And the question is, how do we get people to hear what we want to say? Well, the approach I created and have spent my life devoted to is a way to be heard, regardless of the intensity of the emotions present, regardless of the situation. Yield theory helps you communicate so that you can actually be heard. So what is it? Okay, well, let's imagine that a bear comes running at you. Here's what's going to happen. Your fight or flight response, your amygdala, is going to shoot a message to your adrenal glands to send adrenaline and cortisol throughout your body. And you're going to do one of three things. You're either going to fight the bear, freeze, or flee, run from the bear. Fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, in reality, we're not fighting that bear. It's way too powerful. But the concept is the same. Now, as sure as it's a fact that if a bear came charging at you, that part of your brain would be triggered, your fight, flight, or freeze response. Well, that same part of your brain is triggered when your loved one looks at you and says, "We need to talk." In other words, when we need to protect our body, our fight, flight, or freeze response goes off. But the same is true when we need to protect our ego. So if someone says we need to talk, or let me tell you why you're wrong, or you need to calm down, any of these kinds of things that attack your ego, you're going to defend. And so now you're not really speaking to the part of the brain that you want to take in the information. For example, if you're not struggling with emotions in this present moment as you're watching this as an intellectual discussion, then if we were to put your brain in a brain scan, the odds are we would most likely see the frontal cortex, the front part of your brain, activated. The frontal cortex is your center of higher level thinking, of logic, of reason. And then there's the center of your brain, which is really the center of your emotions. Again, that's the place where your fight, flight, or freeze response, that amygdala, or amygdalae, since there are two of them, is centered. Now, if we want to get around that emotional center and speak to the front part of the brain, the question is, how do we do it? How do we do it? Well, look, I've spent a lifetime trying to break down really complex subjects and make them super simple for people. And so I had to ask myself, what is it that I really do? What do I do? And when I step back, I realized I do three things. That's it, just three things. I listen, I validate, and I explore options. That's really it. I remember about 10 years ago, I was speaking at this mental health convention. There were about 500 people present, and at the break, a woman came up to me, and she was super condescending, which is always fun when people talk down to you. But she came up to me, and she was real condescending, and she said, "Is that it? Is that your big theory? Three things?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, but if you think about it, all Bruce Lee ever did was move, block, and hit, and he did pretty well for himself." You see, we might be able to say the words move, block, and hit, but that doesn't mean we're going to move, block, and hit in the way that Bruce Lee did. And when it comes to listening, validating, and exploring options, simply saying those words doesn't mean that we're doing them effectively. It's how you listen, how you validate, and how you explore options that makes all the difference in the world. And that is why, whereas I definitely strive to make the approach I teach simple and pragmatic, I don't want if there's a crisis around you, to have to think, what's that doctor's fancy 75-point plan? What's it say on page 398? Whenever everything hits the fan, the only thing you want to think about are three things: listen, validate, and explore options. In other words, if you're speaking with someone and the communication isn't working, it's not effective, and you know you're the only person on the planet you can control, then instead of getting wrapped up in what the other person should be doing in that present moment, you focus on the only person you can control, you, and you ask yourself those three things: listen, validate, and explore options. And if you're not listening effectively, then the person is probably going to stay escalated. If maybe you heard them, but they don't feel validated, then they're going to keep escalating. But here's what happens. First, when it comes to yield theory and doing trainings, and this video doesn't constitute a training, it just shows an overview of what yield theory is. My career is devoted to bringing these trainings to institutions, so I'd love for you to contact me and consider having either me or one of the yield theory trainers to come in to work with your organization. But this video is simply an overview. But when it comes to how you listen, how you validate, and how you explore options, well, we teach different ways of listening effectively. And when it comes to validation, I have a saying, which is, don't validate until you think you validated, like it's some bureaucratic box to check off. I did validate. Instead, validate until the other person feels validated. We call it draining the limbic system. In other words, if your limbic system, as a metaphor, was all filled up with water, and you turn on a spigot, and it drains out a little bit of water, but you hurry up and turn it back off, then there's still a whole bunch of water in there. You haven't really drained it at all. And in that same way, if your limbic system, your center of your emotions, is all filled up, and you make a quick statement of validation, and then hurry up and start trying to find solutions and give them answers, well, they haven't been validated. You haven't drained that limbic system, so the emotions are going to stay high. And then when it comes to exploring options, it's not a matter of talking at people about what they should do or should have done. It's about meeting them where they actually are and helping them figure out based on what they're ready, willing, and able to do. And so even though, yes, yield theory does boil down to three core actions, which it does, the truth is that the way we deliver those three core actions is rooted in 7 fundamental components. And in a nutshell, it looks like this. The first fundamental component that drives the way we listen, validate, and explore options is acceptance. And what I mean by acceptance is this: to accept the reality of what's going on, who is involved, what's happening. So I talk about in yield theory the difference between the cartoon world and the real world. The cartoon world is our world of shoulds. People should think, feel, believe, and behave the way I think they should. This person should be calmed down right now. This person should want to listen to me. This person shouldn't have done that. And then there's the real world, how people actually think, feel, believe, and behave. What people actually have said and done. And as long as we align our expectations with our cartoon world, and I call it a cartoon world because it's as fictional as a cartoon land, but as long as we align our expectations with our cartoon world, then when we meet the real world, we're going to be let down. But here's the thing, the world's not letting us down because the world is what the world is. It's our own expectations. And that's why I've spent more than a quarter of a century of my life devoted to helping people align their expectations with reality. The more prepared we are for reality, the more effectively we'll handle it when we inevitably encounter it. So the first fundamental component that drives the way we listen, validate, and explore options is acceptance. And it involves 2 things. First, accepting the real world rather than the cartoon world. And second, accepting where people are in regard to what's called the stages of change, developed by 2 people named Prochaska and DiClementi. And so we want to find out what people, again, are ready, willing, and able to take in. Then the next fundamental component is authenticity. And authenticity boils down to being genuine. Obviously, I don't want to define my word with a definition, but what being genuine means is acting from the place of who you actually are. So let me throw it up really quickly this way. Imagine if we go with Freud's classic topographical model of the psyche. That's a mouthful, but imagine this. If the human psyche, if we looked at it as an iceberg, the majority of the iceberg is below water. And the very small part that's above water, well, that represents consciousness, which is a fancy word for saying awareness. Our consciousness is our awareness. And if you look at this iceberg, the majority of it is underwater. Well, the center of our consciousness is our ego. So our ego is the center of everything of which we are aware, but as you can see, it's very far from the center of who we actually are. Now, whereas everything above the water is consciousness, awareness, everything below the water is the unconscious. And in fact, that small line of the area of water that you could look in and still see some, but it's underneath the water, that would be the subconscious. And there is a difference between consciousness, the subconscious, and the unconscious. And for those interested in psychology, the deeper you go into the dark water, we get to the collective unconscious. All right, let's come back to this in a nutshell. So we can see that the center of our psyches, the center of who we truly are, or what is called the self with a capital S, or the true self, or the essence is how I refer to it in my book, Walking Through Anger. But when we respond from that part of us, that is authenticity. Our egos, which believe that they're right about everything, so your ego significantly tries to convince you that whatever you think you're right about, because it is the center of your consciousness. But the whole point of our process as individuals is to become more conscious, to raise consciousness, or what I would call to expand consciousness, expand our awareness. And so the center of who we are is a humble. The aspect of our essence, it's humble. It's always striving to learn more, to grow. Whereas our ego believes it already has the answers and just seeks to prove itself right. Consider the work of Robert Burton, a leading researcher, a leading neuroscientist who looked at the brain and saw that in concepts like certainty, when we feel certain about something, it more closely aligns with an emotion, whereas when we are logically arguing, we think we're being in our rational frontal cortex, our higher level thinking center of our brain. But the truth is, when we are certain we're right, it actually mirrors an emotion. Okay, so we have the reason why this matters is to be authentic in terms of yield theory is to lead with humility. That means when we listen to someone else, we imagine a box. And when you come up to a box, you can only see 1 to 2 sides of a given box in any particular moment. So if you imagine that box is filled with, or on each side of the box is a screen that shows random pictures. Then when you approach 1 or 2 sides of the box, you can't know what's on the other side. There's no way. And whereas your ego will probably tell you, well, I've been all around the box, I know every side of it. The truth is that the box represents the human psyche. And the only way for me to know what's on the other side of the box is to ask. So I have to have the humility to recognize I do not know what's on your side of the box, and I have to have the curiosity to actually want to know. So in yield theory, we talk about when you listen and lead with the humility of saying, I don't know what's on your side of the box, and the curiosity to say, I want to learn, teach me. And then again, we validate, and we're going to truly validate until you feel validated. And then we can, once you feel validated, begin to explore options. Okay, back to these 7 fundamental components that drive the way we listen, validate, and explore options. Well, the third fundamental component is compassion. And one of the ways that I talk about leading with compassion is this: to recognize that I believe that if I lived every day as another person, so not just walked a metaphorical mile in their shoes, which is beautiful and wonderful, but if I actually lived as that person and had that person's cognitive functioning, their affective range or ability to experience emotions, and if I had their life experiences, how can I possibly say that I would have done anything differently from what they have done? Sure, my ego will kick in and say, well, I had it tough and I didn't do that, and I had this and I had that, and my ego will want to kick in and tell me how I'm right and I would have done things differently had I been them. The reality is that that's my ego speaking from its own experience, its own cognitive functioning and intellectual capacity. And so what I say with yield theory when it comes to compassion is this: if I lived every day as someone else, if I lived every day as you, how can I possibly say I would have done anything differently from what you've done? Which allows me to wipe away judgment, to meet you where you are and realize this: for me, judgment doesn't seem to play an effective role. Whereas there's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is healthy. If you do something and hurt someone, to feel guilt, to feel bad that you've hurt someone, good, that's good. Learn from it, move, grow, move on. But shame, whereas guilt is feeling bad about something you've done, shame is feeling bad about who you are. And my research for more than 2 decades has shown me that when people live in shame, they act out of shame. So if I think I'm a no good piece of nothing, then why not hurt you? And I work really hard to avoid shame. It doesn't mean you can't sit with guilt and learn from it, sit in that emotion for a minute to learn from it, but it's not a matter of dwelling in it. It's about learning and moving on. Because the past is gone and we can't get one single second of it back. No matter how much our ego wants to say, well, I would have done this and I wouldn't have done that. At the end of the day, inducing shame in others is not really truly helpful for this world. Again, doesn't mean people aren't accountable. I am absolutely believe that people need to be accountable. We all need to be accountable for everything we do, everything we say, even everything we think and feel. But at the end of the day, judgment, to me, when it comes to communication, isn't effective. And everything that we do in yield theory boils down to asking ourselves 3 basic questions every time we communicate. What did I do effectively? What did I do ineffectively? What can I learn more effectively next time? The next fundamental component of yield theory is what I call conscious education. And what that means is this: it's not enough to simply listen and validate someone. With yield theory, we intentionally add to that person's life. We want to add insight. A lot of times we use metaphors, we use analogies, we use things that help people gain insight in pragmatic ways. So a lot of times we might do a hands-on technique. So for example, if I were to pick up a phone charger and I say to this phone charger, hey phone charger, you're awful, I don't like you at all. And he's like, oh man. And I'm like, I'm just playing, you're a great phone charger. He's like, oh yay, who's in control of the phone charger? Well, I am, right? And you might think that's so silly, right? How could this guy be telling me about a puppet? Except this: how many times has your day been going one way and someone came along and said or did something that threw your day off? Well, in that moment, that person made you their puppet. And so that physical technique of seeing a puppet, or maybe having, sometimes we will have people hold the phone charger themselves and feel what it's like to actually be controlling someone. Those type of physical techniques help us bring insight to others in conscious education. And the next fundamental component is creativity, and creativity is centered in this: we know that people learn differently. We know that there are different learners, and to meet diverse learners where they are, we have to take diverse approaches. Some people are auditory learners. Some people are visual learners. The point is, we want to meet people where they are, not where we think they should be already. And then the next fundamental component is mindfulness. Mindfulness is more than just a buzzword. Mindfulness is about being aware of how you communicate, your tone of voice, your physical presence. Oftentimes I tell people in a disagreement, if you're standing over top of someone, you might not mean to be in a place of intimidation, but people don't see your intentions, they only see your actions. And we phrase it in yield theory like this: people see your actions, not your intentions. Fascinatingly, we tend to judge other people by their actions, but judge ourselves by our intentions. That's why when we do something wrong, we say, I don't know why you're so mad, I didn't mean it. But if someone does that same thing to us, we get so heated. The next fundamental component, the last one, is non-attachment. Now, non-attachment is, even though I often define the 7 fundamental components as minerals to granite, and just the way granite is made up of different minerals and different amounts of each one, but they're all equally important in creating the strength of the rock granite. In the same way, these fundamental components all combine together to make a solid approach, although we would argue that non-attachment really truly separates whether or not someone's actually practicing yield theory or not. And non-attachment is this idea. If I take all my ideas and I put them in this phone charger, for example, and I hold on to them, and you disagree with my ideas, I take it personally. These are my ideas. How dare you? How dare you disagree with my ideas? But I thought if I would have asked earlier, do I still have more to learn? Or if I ask you right now, do you still have more to learn in life? 100% of the people I've met in my life will say yes. As long as I'm alive, I have more to learn. Well, if I truly believe that I have more to learn as long as I'm alive, then why would I take it personally when you disagree with my thoughts? I might, after all, be wrong, even if I really believe those thoughts intensely. But if I'm attached to my thoughts, I take it personally. But if I take my thoughts and I set them down and you disagree with my thoughts, I recognize you're not disagreeing with the essence of who I am. You simply have different perspective. Non-attachment is powerful. And we get into it a lot in yield theory. We teach it, we go in depth. A typical yield theory training for an organization is usually either 2 or 3 days. Ideally, it's 3 days so we can really dive into it. But we have very comprehensive and effective trainings for people, especially in very large organizations, in 2 full days. But to recognize, it's not just a matter of knowing the 3 core actions or 7 fundamental components. It's about how do you truly integrate them into your life. So we use this example to kind of summarize how yield theory is intended to meet people where they are. There was a man who was charged with leading a group of people up a mountain. So he ran really fast and he got to the top of the mountain and left everyone down at the bottom. They were all on the bottom of the mountain. So he started to scream, "You should be up here with me. I had it tough. I started down there, yet I made it up here." And he started to spit logic at them and say all the reasons of why they should have done things differently, but they can't even see him, let alone hear him. So he becomes known as the fool on the mountain. And the truth is, if he really wanted to lead those people, once he was up there, the only option for him would be to have the self-discipline to leave where he is and go meet them where they were. But the ego would kick in and say, "I shouldn't have to do that." And that's the cartoon world. I shouldn't have to go back down. They should be up here with me. But the truth is, if you're leading them and they have no way up, the only option is for you to leave where you are and go meet them where they are. And so again, we use metaphors to teach. But this is the idea of yield theory, to meet people where they are, to have the self-discipline, to realize you're the only person you can control. And along the way, you learn things when it comes to conscious education, for example, about accurate language. And there's so much about this. Again, a typical training, a basic yield theory introductory training is a 2 full day, a 16-hour training. And that's just a shorter version of the 3 full day one. So understand there's so much more to this than simply what's presented here in this video. But I wanted to give an introduction to have you understand what yield theory is. Some states have adopted using yield theory to train their officers in them. We're gaining more traction. Some counseling centers use yield theory all over the world right now. And so I wanted to share a glimpse, an idea of what yield theory is. Of course, there will be people who only watch this video and state things that they might not agree with, even though they don't realize that this is literally just a snapshot and it's obviously not covering the entirety of what yield theory is. If you want to learn more, I would love for you to get Walking Through Anger. So I wrote Walking Through Anger, and my wife wanted me to call it something else because it's about so much more than anger. It's how you handle any intense emotion, including anger, but how you handle any intense emotion, not only yours, but others. How can you communicate clearly with people regardless of the intensity of emotions present? Well, Walking Through Anger will help you out with that. It's also available as an audio book. So whereas I'm hopeful that this video was helpful for you as a helpful introduction to yield theory, by no means is this meant to be a training or a talk. This is hopefully to gain your interest, to want to learn more about it, but also for those of you who just want to learn, how do I get around other people's fight or flight responses? How do I speak in ways that can be heard? Well, this approach developed in 1998, first published in my Advanced Techniques for Counseling and Psychotherapy book, which came out in 2008 with Springer Publishing. But the more comprehensive approach to understanding it is in my 2019 book, Walking Through Anger. I really emphasized writing that as an evergreen book, so it wasn't about a specific time. That book was written to really last through time because it's about human interactions. It's about human interactions. It's about understanding the difference between your cartoon world and the real world. It's about understanding how to meet people where they are, not where you think they should be already. And it's about how you can add insight to other people's lives, but also pursue constantly your entire life, becoming the best version of yourself. How you can pursue personal growth from every moment, your entire life. How you can understand, too, with true humility. No matter how much you ever feel like you know something, you only ever know one or two sides of a box. You know your perspective, but there's so much more out there. I tell a story about there's no mic drop in life. And I'll end it with this. In life, or if you ever watch a rap battle, they might one person might say whatever they're going to say and then just drop the mic. And the signifying of dropping the mic is saying nothing else needs to be said. But what I say is that in life, there is no mic drop. As long as we're alive, there will always be more to say about something. In the case of yield theory specifically, this very brief intro video only touches on what yield theory is to hopefully light a fire to have you want to learn more. Until next time, as always, I wish you much peace. Thank you again for watching this video. I would love for you to check out the book, Walking Through Anger. It's available on Audible, but you will also find, if you go to drchristianconti.com, some of my other books, two of which, life lessons and teaching stories, are devoted entirely. They're books that are filled with 1 to 2 page stories. So you can randomly flip open to any page and get a teaching tale and gain something from it. I hope it helps. Look, I put my heart and soul into what I do, and I genuinely appreciate you tuning in. Definitely sending you all my best and tons of peace.